Why is it that a 2,000-year-old philosophy suddenly becomes massively popular, selling tens of millions of books and garnering millions of adherents around the world in the age of social media? Why, when made more aware of the problems of the world, do people seem to be more apathetic than ever? And what keeps the world's most prominent Stoic up at night? These are just a few of the questions that we're going to be touching upon in today's episode with my good old friend, Ryan Holiday. Ryan Holiday is a 10-time best-selling author, marketing genius, and founder of the Daily Stoic brand. He has single-handedly brought a school of ancient Greek philosophy to millions of new people around the world. He's been so successful at marketing the philosophy that his name has become almost synonymous with it. It's interesting because my books have often been compared to Stoicism, and people often mistakenly assume that my background is Stoic philosophy, and I'm pretty sure that's Ryan's fault. So, thank you, Ryan. This episode was fun for two different reasons. One is that I visited Ryan down in Texas and we shot this in his beautiful studio. We actually recorded two podcasts. I was on his show, the Daily Stoic podcast, in the morning, and then we recorded this episode in the afternoon. By the way, that episode I did with Ryan is also out today on his podcast feed if you want to go check it out. The other reason it was fun is because I've known Ryan for about 10 years, and he and I have an easy rapport with each other. In fact, I think he gets more personal here in this episode than I've ever heard him get in public elsewhere, as we talk about his family, his regrets, his anxiety, and how he continues to wrestle with the question of how to spend his time well. But before we begin, I'd like to ask that you take a second and follow and review the show. It helps us out immensely when reaching out to new guests and putting together new episodes for you. All right, that's it. On with it. Here is Ryan Holiday.
20 million books sold. 0 fucks given. It's the Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck podcast with your host, Mark Manson.
What do you give too many fucks about?
Ooh, I was going to ask you that question and I didn't, but that is a good question. Like most things, I think that's why you wrote such a huge book about it, but we all care about way too many things than we care about. When you have kids, one of the things that you care about a lot is like, that you know you shouldn't care about is like how you come off, right? Like in public with your, like every parent, you get on a plane with your kids and you're just like, God, I hope they don't like cry this whole flight. Or like, there's this thing of like, you don't want to be seen as a bad parent.
Yeah.
But then you're inherently at the mercy of this like unpredictable, autonomous person, right? And then you add on top of that, which is a new thing for me, which is like, I used to be able to just go through the world as me, just like as a random person. And like fame is the wrong word, but let's say I'm no longer anonymous. And so the being able to be in public with my family for all that, the unpredictability that entails, and then this sense that I'm being watched, I just shouldn't care at all, right?
Yeah.
But, I'm never glad afterwards. Like, I'm so glad I corrected that behavior over and over again because like it really matters how much noise you were making, you know, as we walk down the hallway in this building. I find myself like in that trap that all parents do of like not wanting to be seen as a bad parent and then the sense that I'm being watched as a parent all the time. And it's compounded by the fact that I live in a small town and the people know.
Everybody knows everybody.
So I just have, I'm struggling lately with just this sense that I'm having to perform all the time. And I wish I was just more comfortable. Like, this is who I am. I don't care what you think of me. I think I also give, I give a fuck too much about things that are outside my control. That's like the main one. Just like needing things to be a certain way on a certain time. Like, you know what I mean? Just
Are you like a little bit of like control freak type stuff?
Control freak is
A strong term.
Well, no. What I would say is that it all depends on what that's stemming from. I think I would define myself as a naturally anxious person, and ritual, routine, structure, control are all ways of trying to treat or mitigate that anxiety.
Gotcha.
And so like I see it more like that.
Do you think that's why Stoicism appealed to you so much?
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because anxiety doesn't serve you well. It tortures you. It doesn't do anything. And the idea that there's a very ancient philosophy that has something to say about dealing with that, that's other than like, take this pill or, do this therapy.
Yeah.
I like that.
I think there's an interesting intersection of Stoicism and kind of the present cultural moment with the technology. You've said many times that when you started writing obstacles the way, you accepted very early on, this is an obscure form of ancient philosophy. I don't expect this to sell a ton of books. I don't expect it to become a thing, yet it did.
Yeah.
And it is a huge thing. And there are millions of people who resonate with it and now might even consider themselves Stoics. Why do you think that is? What is it about this moment? Obviously, Stoicism has been around and it's been popular in intellectual circles for centuries. But what is it about today that the masses are resonating with it?
Well, it is funny, right? Because in retrospect, it seems like obviously it would be popular, like because it is popular, right? Mm-hmm. And so sometimes people criticize me or they go like, he popularized this thing or he cashed in on this thing. As like, I remember, so I wrote Trust Me, I'm Lying, which had gotten a very big advance for being a 25-year-old who'd never written any books. And then when I had the idea for The Obstacles Away, my publisher offered me $75,000.
Yeah.
Which is not nothing. That's like, obviously that's a lot of money, but you have to go, that's several years work.
Yeah. For people not familiar with the publishing world, that's not that much.
Yeah. It's the kind of advance they give you because it's easier than saying no. Like they didn't want to lose me as an author.
Yeah.
So that was the least amount of money they could give me without hurting my feelings or driving me to someone else. So, and my editor told me this later. She was like, we hoped you would do this book. It would not work. And then you would go back to doing marketing books. Because they're a business imprint.
Yeah.
So like, not only do I remember that, but that's how I went into putting it out. And I think it sold like 3,000 or 4,000 copies its first week, not nothing. Again, if you're comparing this to a self-published author or some, like starving artist who put out their first novel, this is all great. But like, it was not what it is now.
It is not even a blip on the radar today.
Yeah. I mean, there are days when it sells that many copies,
Yeah.
Many days. So I went into it thinking like, if I could, like, I knew, for instance, like Machiavelli and Sun Tzu had been made popular for business audiences in the 80s and 90s. And like, I'd fallen in love with Stoicism and I thought, well, maybe there's a market for this ancient philosophy in this bit. That was like the most I was hoping for.
Interesting.
And so the freedom of low expectations is a really important thing. That's why I try not to have goals. If you have goals that are outside your control, like you need to sell this or your company needs to make, you're just like, it's just an arbitrary target and you're better off just like seeing where it goes. And the funny thing is, if I'd had any kind of goal remotely close to what it ultimately done, it would have been because I was a delusional, entitled asshole. Do you know what I mean? Like if I could have said, hey, I'm doing this book about an obscure school of ancient philosophy, and I'm hoping it'll sell millions of copies and set in motion like a series of books.
Yeah.
Like you would have been like, this person's insane.
You're out of your mind, yeah.
So that was the freedom of low expectations is a big part of it. But I think the reason it resonated is the reason that Stoicism has always resonated. And it's not fair to say it's an obscure school of ancient philosophy, really, because all schools of philosophy are obscure, right? But for thousands of years, like real people doing real shit have said like, have you ever read Marcus Aurelius or Epictetus? These have been like the kind of underground, like, it's like when people say that like heavy metal is like underground, but it's also enormous at the same time.
Yeah. Stoicism is like your favorite intellectual's favorite intellectuals.
Yes. And also the favorite of the people who are not intellectuals.
Yes.
Like it's the favorite of just, they've only read one philosophy book in their life. This is one of those people. Like, and so I think what Stoicism speaks to and has always spoken to is this idea that like, we don't control the world around us, but we know we have some control over ourselves. And no one really tells us like what we should or shouldn't be. Like this question of like, well, what's a good framework or operating system for like being a person in this crazy fucked up world? That to me is what Stoicism is. And it's kind of been refined over thousands of years. Like, here's a way of thinking about it. Do that. It's that. That's really cool.
Has your relationship with Stoicism changed since becoming so successful with it?
Yeah. I mean, look, Stoicism as a philosophy for dealing with adversity or, like ordinary life is great. And on the one end of this spectrum of Stoics, you have like Epictetus, you have Zeno, who found Stoicism after the shipwreck where he loses everything. You have Cleanthes, who was like a basically a manual laborer who worked in the gardens of these rich people in Athens. So like it's always been on that end of the spectrum. There's been a ton that Stoicism can tell you, like what to do when a tyrant throws you into exile, right?
Yeah.
But on the other end of the spectrum, Stoicism has also really been popular with extremely successful people. Not that Stoicism helps you be extremely successful,
Right.
but like Marcus Aurelius is relying on the same philosophy as Epictetus, but their lives are as different as they could be, but there's a horseshoe element to it of like the emperor is not as free as you would think. And the emperor is stressed beyond you could possibly imagine and tempted in all of these ways. So I think like Stoicism as the books have worked, and I've done other stuff, and Stoicism as a philosophy for dealing with that, for dealing with ego, for dealing with, ambition, for dealing with temptation, for dealing with self-mastery, like it, in a way, it's almost more interesting and more helpful, I think.
Yeah, because it's when you're at the top of the totem pole, there are no guardrails.
Yeah.
So in many ways, it's harder to say no to things than it is to get out of adversity.
It's easy to say no to things you're not being offered.
Exactly. That's a good way of putting it.
It's easier to not do things that you're not in a position to do.
Right.
So you can imagine Marcus Aurelius like unlimited power. So when he says, he talks, there's this beautiful passage in Meditations where he's talking about, he says, take care not to be Caesarified, not to be stained purple.
Yeah.
Like the only check on Marcus Aurelius, because the Senate at this time in Rome is a ceremonial body almost entirely. Like the only check is Marcus Aurelius. Like he's the check on himself. You could say the philosophy is the check on him. It's the final check and balance. And so, yeah, I think I've relied on it more than I did early because I don't know, early, like my life was pretty good, and not to say I didn't experience adversity or difficulty, but it's just like, it's a different set of obstacles when you achieve the things that you want to achieve.
What do you give too few fucks about?
Ooh, what do I not care enough about?
I feel like this is a question to ask your wife.
Yeah. No. I think if you're like a creative, introverted person, you can kind of live in your own world, And one of my favorite novelists, Walker Percy, if you ever read like The Moviegoer or anything, he talks about this problem of re-entry for creatives. Like you go out into this world, then you have to re-enter the regular world. And it's exacerbated by the fact that a lot of the advice for successful people is like outsource everything. Yeah. It's almost like you design your life to be this like pampered baby that only does things you want to do. And there's value in that. Like, you don't need to be like changing your own oil if you can pay someone to do it. But at the same time, like this says something about me, but it's taken work for me to be like, I'm only the main character in my own life. But if you are in relationships, how I've had to consciously give a fuck about just first off, how my mood, my decisions, whatever, have consequences for other people. And then also just, although the temptation is there, not designing your life where everything revolves around you and you only do the things you want to do.
Would you say part of that is being present?
Definitely being present, especially when you're working on a book, because you're always working on a book. Like there's some part of your brain that's working on it all the time. And how do you like actually be where you are? You get really good at just following your mind wherever it's taking you. But that's not fair to a 3-year-old or to your spouse, or it's not fair to the just random person in front of you that you're talking to. So I think that, but also just going like, you took like a year off. The Justice book that I did was finished in January of 23. It was supposed to come out in the fall of 23, but I pushed it until June of this year. And I just decided to just be kind of home and around more. Like I weirdly sort of consciously just decided to like, just do more shit around my house. Like I'm going to do most of the drop-offs and pickups. The division of labor in a house. Yeah. When, you can set it up in your favor when you're the primary breadwinner. Yeah. When you have this thing that's hard that no one else can do. You know what I mean? Like, and so just the decision to do that, like I decide to give a fuck about things that I got really used to never thinking about because they took away from my main thing, which was writing. So the decision to be like, I want to be really good at what I do, but I also want to be more of a functioning person in the world. Yeah. having worked really hard at like almost, well, the word for it in really, they call it weaponized incompetence. Like a lot of dudes do that, especially just naturally, but it wasn't so much that. It's just like, if you're a genius theoretical physicist, you just in the way if you're a all-star point guard, they're just like, Ryan shouldn't be booking his own travel. Like Ryan, you know, like how do we make things as easy as possible for this star, you know? And so you just get used to not caring about things that are not that.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I just decided to care more about that stuff.
It's interesting. Every time I come and visit you out here, it's incredibly impressive. Like you have constructed a life between the bookstore, the studio, the farm, everything out here. Like it is so optimized around what you're optimizing for in your business and in your life. And from the outside, it's incredibly impressive. But a lot of people, I don't know if people know, but you know, a lot of us authors know each other.
Yeah.
You know, you, me, James, Tim Urban, like we all known each other for many, many years. And it's funny because the conversation about you when you're not around is like, dude, does that guy do anything other than write books? Like, does he sleep? Does he take a Saturday off? Does he ever go to a movie? You know, it's like your level of productivity and optimization is maybe the highest of anybody I know personally. And that is a quasi compliment.
It's weird.
But it's, I guess what I'm getting at is that it sounds like some of this is the fallout of that.
It's definitely the fallout of that, but like, and the pandemic was very helpful because it just blew up everyone's life, right? And so it allowed me to reset in some ways. And I'm probably, if my wife was listening, she would maybe take some umbrage with the idea that some of these were like decisions that I made, as opposed to say ultimatums and come to Jesus conversations, or just finally getting things that someone has been attempting to communicate for a very long time.
Right.
At the same time, I've always, like, my wife and I have been together since we were 20, and I've never worked 20-hour days. I've never pulled all night. Like, I've always been, I think, more rooted and a homebody than maybe people think that I was.
Yeah.
But like, I work banker's hours, and that's like generous. Do you know what I mean? Like, I got here today at 9, and I'm going to pick my son up at 3:30.
Yeah.
You know, and that's like a normal day for me. So I do feel like I'm much more disciplined and have better boundaries than like a lot of, first off, than most creatives, then I think people assume that I do because of the output. And to me, that's because I think a lot of people are full of shit and they're incredibly inefficient.
Yes, you are incredibly efficient. It's funny because we did your podcast and we had lunch and you were like, when do you want to do yours? And I was like, 15 minutes. And you just disappeared, like disappeared. And I think, and this is not a knock on you. Like this is, I've known you a long time. I'm like, oh yeah, it's Ryan. But like probably every other person I know would probably still hang out at the table and just shoot the shit for 15 minutes.
Yeah.
And
I was trying to be, I thought you would wanted some space. Like I definitely did, but I also was like,
yeah, it's fine. It's fine. I'm not knocking you. I mean, but it's funny because it's, you know, if we were meeting for the first time, I might be like, what the fuck? You know, but I've known you forever. I'm like, yeah, it's Ryan being Ryan. So I could see when it comes to being present.
Yes.
Being both physically and mentally present with a family. So how has that worked out?
The improvements or the changes I'm talking about?
Yes.
I feel weird talking about the horrors that was the pandemic of having emerged from it much better because like it just, I mean, first off, I didn't travel. Like we drove some places and we had a little camper trailer. So I wasn't like stuck in my house. Sure. But like I didn't spend the night apart from my family for 500 days. Wow. Which is like the most I've never like not gotten on an airplane, probably including my own upbringing. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. And so it was just a total reset in a lot of ways that was amazing. And it took out a bunch of stuff that, I don't know, I just like don't really do shit anymore. Like I don't like, Austin Kleon, when I first moved here, he told me, he was like, work, family, scene, pick 2. Yeah. And I think about that all the time. Yeah. And so I basically don't do the scene thing at all. Yeah. Which has meant I pass on like a lot of stuff that's cool. Like, you know, I've been offered like Super Bowl tickets multiple times from teams in the Super Bowl. And I've said no. Like, would it be cool to do that? Or it's like, we're all going heli skiing. Do you want to come? Or like, just like I turn down like cool stuff because I understand it's coming at the cost of the two more important things for me.
Is that hard?
I would say it's hard in some ways, and it's easier. And it's easy because I think I'm naturally pretty introverted, and I also like my life.
Yeah.
It's hard in the sense that I know my life has been changed by random things that I said yes to, right? And then but it's easier when you start to make a habit of it.
Yeah.
Like, I imagine for you, when you took your year off, when you decided to take a year off and then you started saying no to things, it becomes the default. And then when it's the default, it's great.
Yes.
The problem is the default for most of us most of the time is yes.
Yeah.
But I would say I think two things. I talk about this in the afterword of the Justice book a little bit. Like, the hardest part was not the changes. The hardest part was you make the changes and then you can't make the changes and not have to face the implications of how self-absorbed or selfish or unbalanced it was previously. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And this is the other thing, this generation of people spends like more time with their kids than the last generation and the last generation, So that's all great. But another way to think about it, instead of like how shitty were men back then, is like what were men missing out on back then?
Right.
So that's another bit of cognitive dissonance that can be painful when you go, oh, I didn't do these things because I thought it would affect me professionally or whatever.
Yeah.
And then you change and it doesn't affect you professionally. And you go, so what was I doing it for?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like,
Sure.
You would think it'd be like, hey, I'm suddenly going to be home more and I'm going to do more stuff and I'm going to take on these things. Like nobody throws you a parade. They're like, where the fuck have you been?
Yeah.
And also like I get this, like when I get home, like if I travel, like I go to do a talk and then I come home. Sometimes my wife goes like, you understand, like nobody hit pause here.
Yeah.
And then you have to re-enter into this thing.
Yeah.
Right. And so the implication being like the idea that you can just come and go as you please. You can only maintain that if you decide you're the center of the universe, which you're not.
I can relate to that. My reset showed me a lot of the same things of how when the default becomes no, there are all these opportunities that when you took them, you thought they were so valuable and, oh my God, this is a once in a lifetime thing. And then when you start passing them up, you realize like, oh, it's nothing. It like doesn't mean anything. I
think the one I still struggle with is this. You have this insecurity mixed with this sort of like scarcity mindset mixed with this idea that the musical chairs are going to stop at some point.
Yes.
Which they are.
Yes.
But every time you turn down an offer to do something, part of what's preventing you from turning it down is the belief that it's the last time you're going to be offered that thing.
Yeah.
That you're not going to be sitting back at the end of the year and go, this year was way busier than last year. I did more than last year.
Yeah.
I still struggle with that a lot. So it's so hard for me to say no. That part of why I live here and have set up my life and I have a reputation is so I just get asked less.
Yeah.
What I don't know about can't give me FOMO.
You mentioned in passing kind of a sense of lament or struggling with feelings of guilt or regret. Would you describe that as a regret?
Yeah. I mean, it's a regret. There's guilt. There's a sense that I don't know how I would think about it, actually. Yeah, I think all those things. It's my favorite thing. And how often I prioritize things that were not even close to my favorite thing to do that. Do you know what I mean? And when the stuff went away, I didn't miss it.
Yeah.
But I would miss this.
Right.
But then why do you choose that thing over the other thing?
I think it's interesting to me because, and this is a drum I bang on quite a bit, which is that self-improvement is often accompanied with a lot of negative feelings, guilt, regret, shame. And it comes in different forms. Like sometimes you have to like grieve an old identity.
Yeah.
And in this case, you almost have to grieve a life you could have had or time you could have had, but didn't.
Yeah. Epictetus says the philosophy classroom is like a hospital because you weren't well when you entered. Like he's saying, you're sick. You came to it because something wasn't working.
Yeah.
You weren't who you wanted to be. You weren't what you were capable of being. When you do this work on yourself, you find like assumptions or decisions you were making or patterns that you're in And most people come face to face with that and then decide to double down or deny it or blame other people. And then there's the other path where you have to wrestle with it and deal with it. And like, you can't do anything but make amends for it. You can't do anything but try to be different in the future, or just grieve what could have been that wasn't. Again, I don't feel like I wasn't terrible at it, you know, but
it's not like you were a deadbeat dad.
No. I'm not like coming belatedly, but it's just more like, even though I was doing, it's like I was doing the large building blocks were there, you know, I was never like, oh, I was gone for a month to do this thing or whatever, but it just was just like not fully understanding how much of the load of what you do is borne by other people.
Yeah.
And the decision to be like, I'm going to try to deal as much as I can with my own. I'm just going to, all you can really do in this life is carry your own fucking weight.
Yeah.
And the decision to see where you haven't been carrying your own weight and carry that weight is like the starting point. And then hopefully you can also help other people with theirs. But that's kind of how I've been thinking about it.
What do you think most people give too many fucks about?
Yeah. I mean, I think most people care too much about the things that other people told them they should care about. This is Rene Girard, right?
Yeah.
That we don't know what we want, so we want what other people want. And they don't really stop and go, here's what makes me happy. Here's what lights me up. And because they haven't done that work, they're just like, well, what seems to light other people up? What are the things that are important? You just end up trying to like win these races where, first off, maybe the outcome isn't really up to you. And then the outcome is like not great.
Yeah.
You know, like how many people become lawyers because they don't know what they want to do with their life? Even though like the data is very clear on how unhappy lawyers are.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think that's a big one. It's like people just, they don't really know what to care about or not care about. And so they kind of just default to like whatever they fell into or whatever seems a lot of people care about. And the real problem with that is that by definition, that's the most competitive stuff. So when you're kind of doing your own thing and you set your life up in the unique way that is only possible for you, chances are you're not fighting for, you know, like if you live in New York City because that's where you heard people like you are supposed to go, I don't think it's a surprise to go like it's more expensive to live there because a lot of people want to live there.
Yeah.
But if actually you're uniquely suited to live in Gary, Indiana, you're going to find out it's very easy to live in Gary, Indiana. You're paying for it another way. but the point is you don't understand you're paying a premium in say rent or taxes for a thing that you're not getting. Now, if New York is the only place in the world for someone like you, or San Francisco is the only place in the person, or Paris or whatever, then by all means, gladly pay those what it costs to do that thing. But are you sure that's the thing for you?
I love this topic because it's part of it, I think, is just necessarily human. Like if you look at young people, like the way you learn anything is you mimic and adopt the scripts and narratives and skills and behaviors that other people exhibit and try to mimic them yourself, adopt them for yourself. The next step after you've done all of that, you know, that is in a sense what education is. It's just taking all of civilization's knowledge and forcing young people to mimic it until they understand it or can behave in the appropriate ways. I think what probably most people never get to the point of doing is just realizing that those are simply scripts and narratives that were handed down through the generations and that you don't necessarily have to follow it and that you probably should question each of those things. And it's fine if you question it and decide to come back to it. You know, it's like mom and dad raised you in a certain religion or culture. You deviate, you question it, you experiment outside of it, you decide, no, I like mom and dad's way, and you come back to it. But I think that experimentation outside of whatever your default script is so important from just like a self-esteem perspective, because when you do come back to it, at least now you know, I tried the other thing, wasn't for me. Mom and dad had it right all along. Yeah. And then you can like live in that with confidence. You don't have to like put blinders on and
you got to learn the rules before you break them. But my sister-in-law said something to me once. She was talking about how she had always been like scared to drive at night. Like she didn't like driving at night.
Yeah.
And then she was saying that she realized that actually her mom was scared to drive at night. Like this was just a thing that she just heard. Mom was scared to drive at night. Mom talked a lot about it's dangerous to drive at night, always made dad drive at night, whatever, right? So it just became this like inherited assumption, this part of her worldview, but like had never actually challenged it or said, like, is this true for me? Now, it could be ultimately that it is true for her. But in that moment, it wasn't. And she was just realizing that it was like an inherited, unquestioned assumption. Mm-hmm. And we all do this, right? Because stuff happens to us in our childhood. As I understand it, you have these things that happen in your childhood, or you're neglected, you have some problem in your childhood, and you come up with some childish way of addressing that feeling or distress or pain. Yeah. They call this the adapted child, right? And then you become an adult, and you have to ask yourself, like, am I being the adult? Or am I being the adapted child, right? And I think a lot of people give a lot of fucks or care a lot about things that are about coping with assumptions or environments that they're no longer in, or that they're on paths that were set up for them by their parents or their culture, or even just like the era they grew up in.
Right. And
they haven't stopped and asked this really essential question, which is this still true? And is it true to me personally? Mm-hmm. And so those are really powerful questions, and you can free yourself of a lot of baggage. And it doesn't have to be judgmental, right? It could just be like, this was true at the time. This is what I thought or what I needed when I was 15. It's what I needed when I was 25. It's what I needed when I was 35. But like, that's not me anymore. And so I don't have to care about that stuff.
You know, my marriage, especially marrying somebody from a completely different culture,
sure.
There's so many times throughout my marriage where we'll like get into an argument about something, and ultimately the root of the issue, after like going around in circles for 30 minutes, the root of the issue is simply we have different definitions of the same word.
Yeah.
Like her idea of clean is different than my idea of clean, or her idea of saving money is different than my idea of saving money. And until we actually like get to the point where we can look at our definitions and ask ourselves like, well, is that a good definition? Is my definition good? Okay, yeah, no, my definition actually probably doesn't make sense. Or let's find a compromise definition.
Yeah.
I feel like so much of a relationship conflict, and actually probably the healing part of relationships as well, is renegotiating the meaning of a lot of those narratives and stuff.
Was it my opinion that was driving it? Or was it, hey, I want to do this way, or I think it should be this way, or it should be this many times, or whatever? Was that actually based on like my needs and desires, or my sense of what my needs and desires would be, or how I would feel if someone else knew about it, right? So it comes back to this Girardian thing of like, is this what you're after, or is it what you feel like you should be after, or how you saw it in your household? And the ability to sit down and go like, well, what do I really believe? What's actually important to me? What are my needs? How do I want things to go? Are we actually totally in agreement here?
Yeah.
And there's just some like external noise that's adding pressure on this situation. And then you can kind of reset. Do you know the Kurt Vonnegut thing where he says all fights in marriages can be boiled down to this one idea, which is that you are saying to that other person, you're not enough people. and I think that's totally true. He was commenting primarily on the sort of the idea of the nuclear family.
Yeah.
That, you know, people used to live in these extended networks, and the spouse wasn't asked to do so much. And I think you could say, yeah, you're not enough people. And then also like a lot of them are rooted in, a lot of the arguments in spouses are rooted in assumptions that neither of you actually believe, but have just gotten used to insisting on or thinking is what you want.
There's an inertia that happens with values and beliefs. And the nuclear family thing is interesting. I had David Brooks on the podcast, and he talked about that.
He's great.
It was an amazing conversation. He talked about how the idea of two parents and X number of kids is like a really recent idea. And
that both of them would be employed full time at something?
That's a that's like a 2-generation idea. And he pointed out that like it might be unreasonable to expect all of your needs and wants to be fulfilled, or all of the duties and expectations to be fulfilled by like a singular person.
Yeah.
Whereas in the past, there was probably like siblings, in-laws, aunts, uncles, you know, either in the house or in the neighborhood who could like take off some of that load.
Yeah, and we're asking both parents to do way more than they've ever done before.
Right.
In the sense that like families used to be like pretty okay with like a couple of the kids dying. Do you know what I'm saying? Like
we need to go back to that.
no, I'm just
I'm
like
joking,
it would be
I'm
like
joking.
like you just when you read history and you read about like the incredible amount of preventable deaths.
Yes.
I mean, I'm saying it's way better that but it is like a lot. Do you know what I mean? Like I was just reading some book, I forgot what it was, and it was like the mom had to go do something, so she just like left her kids that are my age just like in the cabin by themselves for like 2 weeks. You know what I mean? You would get arrested and spend like years in jail if you did that.
I've seen multiple news stories of parents getting arrested that I was like, my parents did that. You know,
yeah,
like,
of course.
Like leaving a kid at home overnight, you know, playing outside until like 9 p.m. Like,
yeah. And I'm not saying that's like the way it should be. I'm just saying like we're now expecting people to do more
it is
with less.
And I think it's an unreasonable expectation.
Yes. Agreed.
I think we've maybe overcorrected. Last question.
Oh, okay.
What do most people give too few fucks about?
Well, I just as I'm thinking about this with the book I'm doing now, I think most of us give too few fucks about basically anyone but ourselves. So we care way too much about like what other people think and blah, 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 blah. And then we are very indifferent to the vast amounts of preventable suffering that are happening in the world. Like, so Peter Singer, the ethicist, the ethical philosopher's like premise is like, okay, if you were like walking to work and you saw a child drowning in a puddle in front of you, you would obviously not allow that. You would not jump over them because you didn't want to get your like clothes dirty. Mm-hmm. But like some version of that is happening all over the world constantly, right? And a lot of it is like quite affordable to make a substantial indent in doing this. We're talking about like malaria nets or whatever. So I feel like we just don't care a lot about what's happening to other people. The pandemic was obviously a huge example of this, where like for a couple weeks we were kind of all on the same page. Mm-hmm. And then although we were arguing about this or that, fundamentally one segment of society was arguing with another segment of society as to why they should give a shit about how their actions affect other people. That's obviously horrendous. You know, you think about something like the opioid crisis, which is this devastating, slow moving, like human catastrophe. It's not like it's this totally unprecedented thing. Almost exactly as the opioid crisis was beginning, the crack epidemic was ending. And America specifically decided to see the crack epidemic as like a moral failing of a certain group of people or segment of society, or as primarily an inner city problem, right? Had we decided instead to go like, this is a public health crisis, and if one community is threatened, potentially all other communities are threatened, and decided to figure out as a society what you do about addiction instead of just criminalizing drug use and like locking people up, or ignoring that it's happening altogether, maybe we would have been in a better position to do something when a much more potent drug epidemic happens that affects like everyone. Right. Do you know what I mean?
Totally.
And so I think you shouldn't care what other people think. You shouldn't care about things that are outside your control. At the same time, cultivating a sense about the validity and dignity and sacredness of life itself. I think Albert Schweitzer had this expression, I think he would say it in French, but it was like a reverence for life. Like just caring about life is probably what we don't give a shit enough about.
There's a lot to dig into there. I want to go back to this Peter Singer thing.
Yeah.
So on your podcast a couple hours ago, we were discussing moral philosophy and how it's one thing to toil theoretically with moral questions, and another one entirely to think about implementation. And I think about the Singer thing and I'm like, okay, yes, from a moral point of view, a kid drowning 10 feet in front of me and a kid starving to death in Africa or wherever, morally, those two things are equivalent. And yes, in a perfect system, in a perfect world, if I can just pay $10 and save that kid in Africa's life, I should do that. I think what gets lost in that, and I don't have a high conviction, like my beliefs on this are not high conviction. So there are coordination problems. There are executive and administrative problems. How does that $10 get there?
Yeah.
Who is spending it? Where are they sourcing it? How does that sourcing affect other parts of the economy in that area. Of that $10, how much is actually making it to the kid and how much is, going to like, some NGO in Switzerland or something. Again, it's that in theory, I agree wholeheartedly. I think we had a whole conversation earlier about how the trickiness of moral problems is almost always in the implementation. And I would argue that with things like the pandemic, the opioid crisis, and maybe even the crack epidemic, obviously there are some horrible people who just don't give a shit and they're very cynical and callous about it. But maybe I'm naively optimistic, but I feel like the opioid crisis, I think there's probably almost universal agreement that it's a horrible, tragic thing. Yet seemingly nothing is really being done about it. And when I look at why, I think it's in those questions of administrative systems, how are things executed? What are the implementations of it? There's probably a network of systems that are so interlaced and tied up in each other that to get anything to move or change is like...
Oh, I totally agree. And look, there's so many problems with the effective altruism, not just philosophically, but practically, as
Sure.
we have seen. I do think it's illustrative that like effective altruism is like a recent invention. Like we've been obviously generous for thousands of years, but
Right.
no one was ever like, how do we actually get good at this? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I'm just saying, look, there are obviously like psychopaths and sociopaths who don't care about other people. And then there's people who think that just caring about other people is enough.
Yeah.
And so on both ends of the spectrum, I don't know if I would totally agree that most people care. I would argue there is this impulse in every human being to look at a problem that is happening in the world. And the mind is very good at looking at that thing and trying to figure out a way that you can say to yourself, this is either not a problem or it's not my problem.
Not my problem, yeah.
And that's sort of what I'm talking about. The idea that because someone's different than you, they live differently than you, they have different beliefs than you, when we make decisions or we put in policies, they affect people. Like now someone can't get IVF.
Yeah.
Now someone can't worship the faith that they want to worship. Or, so again, it's across the political spectrum, but thinking about how the decisions you make or the views you have land on other people, presumably people you will never meet and know nothing about.
Yeah.
That to me is something we could use more of we should care less about a whole bunch of things that don't really matter.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that really does matter.
So Derek Thompson published a piece just, I think a few days ago, about a new study actually done by, it's really interesting. A Danish political scientist did a study on American voters, which I love. It was really interesting what he did. So he intentionally put out fake conspiracy theories about both Republicans and Democrats on social media. Yeah. And then he tracked who shared what, who liked what, who did whatever. The expectation, obviously, was that Republicans were going to like and share conspiracy theories about Democrats, and Democrats were going to like and share conspiracy theories about Republicans. Was not what happened at all. What he found was that there were a minority of Democrats and a minority of Republicans who shared everything.
Yeah.
So it's basically like 90% of people just don't give a shit about conspiracy theories. They see them for what they are. And then there's 10% of people, regardless of party, who share all of them. So the Democrats shared conspiracy theories about Hillary Clinton just as much as they shared conspiracy theories about Donald Trump. And he actually went and interviewed these people. And his conclusion was that there's a small subset of people in the United States who seem to just have this need for chaos.
Yeah. Some people just want to watch the world burn.
That's exactly what it is. That they have given up hope on the system entirely, that they have no illusions that it's ever going to do anything for them, either party, no matter what. And they just want to sow chaos, which, that scares the shit out of me.
Yeah.
Because I don't know how you retrieve those people.
No, I don't know if you can. The ease with which people can be infected by those people, or those people can care so much that other people who are busy and generally do care go like, it's not worth it.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? Like, it's just, this is a morass this is an unending, unwinnable battle. Yeah. I'm just going to focus on other shit. And when you don't really understand sort of like how civil rights movement happened, you forget, like, the Reconstruction ends because the South realized that although the North could beat the South in a civil war, it could not perpetually occupy the South and it wasn't prepared to win a battle for the hearts and minds over this issue, which the issue was not whether we could own people or not. Ultimately, it was whether the country was really predicated on the idea that all men were created equal. And the South just realized, if we lynch enough people, if we sow enough chaos, if we cause enough trouble, eventually the North's will collapse. And at some point, they'll need something from us, and we'll be able to negotiate a compromise where we get to not reinstate slavery, but protect enough of the status quo that we can live with it. So then, like, when you watch these videos, like during the civil rights movement, of like the fire hoses and the beatings, and you go, what did they think? How did they think this was going to go? Like, what they knew was, hey, if we're awful enough and we make it hard enough to enact these federal laws at the state and local level, Democrats won't be in office forever. You know what I mean? Or like one of us will win the presidency, or just people will get tired and move on to the other. They just knew that eventually they would give up, right? And so I think the problem is, like, the crazy, awful chaos agents, cynics, whatever, it's like an asymmetry where they know that if they just make it hard enough, painful enough, exhausting enough, you'll just go back to your own life, right? And so it's not just that you have to care, you have to like really care. Like to wrap your head around the sustained interest and commitment it took to abolish the slave trade, to the women's rights movement took like 70 years. Like Seneca Falls to the passage of women's suffrage is like 70 years, something like that, right? And like, it took forever. And every fucking state and every fucking city was this massive battle over an issue that's obviously morally, clear, right? In retrospect. But like, it wasn't like some people really cared and some people didn't care. But like, if you want to make any kind of moral difference in the world, you have to care like to an incredible degree. So this is also why you have to pick which fucks you care about.
Yeah.
Like, do you care about like pronouns, or do you care about like, legal protections and so you have to pick your battles. But I don't know. That's I don't mean to sound like I'm on some high horse, but it's just what I've been thinking about a lot and realizing like what alarms me about the world that I'm bringing my kids into, but also what I see is just like, it's not apathy, but it's almost like an energizing of awfulness. I don't know. I probably took this way far.
Ryan Holiday, everybody. In his high horse.
You can read about this in my worst selling book about the Stoic virtue of justice.
What is it? What is the justice book called?
Right Thing, Right Now.
Okay.
And then the subtitle, which I've gone back and forth. You tell me if you hate it because the ink's not dry, but it's Right Thing, Right Now. Good values, good character, good deeds.
It's not bad.
Ideally you want something better than not bad, but
it's not terrible.
I don't hate it.
Yeah. I'm not going to be, whistling it to myself when I drive back, but it will suffice. How's that for a promo?
I'm actually going to put that on my cover.
Yeah, Ryan Holiday's new book, It Will Suffice.
Not terrible.
Yeah, not terrible. I've read worse.
As far as the title goes, I thought it was okay.
No, I like it. It's catchy. It's got a little Van Halen thing going.
Oh, yeah.
Right now. You should get Sammy Hagar to, come on your book tour with you.
David Lee Roth is mentioned as an offhand comment in the book, and so is David Brooks. So I have a chapter on the second mountain, like climbing the second mountain. Oh, nice. And, he just decided on a lark to become paramedic in New York City, like for fun.
Yeah, I remember that.
And I just think that's great. That's what more people should do that. You should take your success. And I taught English for 2 years or whatever.
Yeah.
Lou Gehrig, after people know like Lou Gehrig gets his baseball career cut short, he spends like the last 3 years of his life, he's the head of the New York City parole board.
Oh, wow.
Like he could have made a fortune or done nothing, like, putting his name on a nightclub or something. Instead,
that's fascinating.
He just approves and denies, like rehabilitates criminals, basically.
Wow. I wonder why he chose that.
LaGuardia offers him a job,
Yeah.
and he wants to be of use. And I think he
Huh.
probably exactly what David Brooks is talking about in The Second Mountain, which is like,
he's like, I swung a bat and hit a ball my whole life. I want to do something that's meaningful.
yeah, and also I'm gonna die.
Yeah, totally.
And so how am I paying back
Yeah.
what I've been given?
Cool.
Thanks, man.
Yeah, man. This was fun.